Okay, so thank you very much to the organizers. It is a great occasion for me to present the work I've been doing in the last 5 years. I am going to present the first part of my latest book, Kant's Political Legacy. Some of my colleagues here have already read and commented on the book, so apologies for a little bit of repetition here. I'll try to overview the main steps of the argument, and I'll try to make a few steps farther than what I've got in the book, so that perhaps we can have a discussion that will help me in the continuation of my research. Okay, so there is little need to argue for the importance of human rights in today's world. We are celebrating the 70th birthday of the Universal Declaration, and if one looks at their role in 1948, when they were first officially introduced by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, comparing it with the role they play today in various contexts, one can hardly deny that their impact has increased beyond anything the drafter could have hoped or imagined. Human rights today are not only the official normative language that most political actors speak around the world, not always in good faith, of course. They are also standards that determine, one, the conditions of legitimate sovereignty, b, whether the international community has a right to intervene in different forms, up to military actions against governments or power groups that violate them massively and systematically. 3, whether countries are eligible to enter the European Union, for example, the accountability of the 47 governments that are members of the Council of Europe to an international tribunal such as the European Court of Human Rights, which delivers, by the way, binding judgments, often leading to the alteration of national legislation. In addition, we would say they are also the backbone and raison d'etre of a number of international and national institutions and influential NGOs. Finally, and perhaps most obviously, they are a source of inspirations for millions of activists around the world, providing them with a common normative language. So, quite simply, and quite apart from how often human rights are violated in our world, these standards have long since ceased to be mere occasions for moral outrage and protest. They have become standards of political decency with concrete repercussions. If human rights today have a far greater impact on politics than in the past, the philosophical reflection that surrounds them has had a less fortunate history. It is doubtful whether we are today in a better position than in 1948 to answer any of the following questions. Why are human rights rights? Why are they human rights? Are they different from mere moral rights? Are they political rights with no moral substratum, as some people claim? Are they an extension of traditional natural rights? Or are they fundamentally different? What human goods, liberties, or prerogatives should they protect? Is democracy a human right? Are human rights ultimately Western standards? Do they have a legitimate application in contexts not infused with a liberal democratic public culture? And finally, and perhaps most crucially, what is their foundation, quite simply? That is, why are they standards of whatever sort, political, moral, that we should adopt or at least take seriously? Okay, so this presentation of my work intends to offer just an overview of this book I've written, and in particular on the question related to the foundation of human rights. So I'm going to show why the main orientation in the contemporary philosophy of human rights all fail, in my opinion at least, to yield a satisfactory foundation. To borrow from this book, Kant's Political Legacy, the idea of an alternative foundation that exploits in a rather critical manner Kant's account of human dignity, and list the main objection my foundation has already attracted or is bound to attract, in my opinion, in the future. And finally, address 3 of them. Why 3? Well, because I don't have space for more than that, and because I haven't gotten farther than answering to a certain satisfaction for myself the evidence. Okay, just, the objective is to prove that despite the many difficulties that the Kant-inspired approach has, there are more resources at our disposal, our being we Kantians, for addressing these objections. Okay, so let me show in the first part why I think that something is going fundamentally wrong in the foundational debate about human rights today. Philosophers working on human rights today fall quite neatly in one of the following categories. I haven't invented these categories. Categories are now standard in the literature. On the one hand, instrumentalism, also known as productivism, non-instrumentalism, also known as orthodoxy, and practice-based or political approaches. Okay, let's overview them and their difficulties. Instrumentalism. Instrumentalists identify human rights with standards that have a binding normativity simply because they are instrumental to certain goods we certainly need. Human rights have normative force then because without them societies would hardly flourish or even reach decent standard of well-being. Thus, human rights do not protect any intrinsic dignity of human beings, rather they protect and serve fundamental human needs and are to be taken seriously as long as we care about humans. When it comes to specifying what these goods are, instrumentalists have different answers. Some think that agency is the feature in question. For example, Griffin thinks that human rights protect human dignity by affording humans the means necessary to exercise their capacity for agency. Alternative instrumentalist accounts suggest that a plurality of goods, not just one, like agency, lies at the foundation of human rights. So John Finnis, for example, suggested an allegedly objective list of human goods such as life, knowledge, play, aesthetic experience, sociability, friendship, practical reasonableness, religion. Similarly, James Nickel argues that human rights secure and are thereby justified by four values: life, the steering of one's life, avoidance of cruel and degrading treatment, avoidance of severely unfair treatment. These four things are intrinsically different from one another, and of course no reduction of each of them is possible to the others. Lyell and Renzo also include in the instrumentalist pluralist family the position of John Tasiulas, Henry Shue, David Miller, Amartya Sen, and Martha Nussbaum. Okay, what's the problem with instrumentalism? Well, there are specific problems that each of these variations of instrumentalism presents. For the sake of brevity, let me go to what seems to me and others as the fatal shortcoming. All instrumentalist accounts conflate needs, goods, capabilities on one hand with rights on the other. The fact that something is very important for me and for all other human beings, so no question of whether it's just for me and not for others, but still is not a sufficient reason to turn that thing into something I have a right to use Ra's fortunate example, being loved is among the most important things in human life, but would it make sense to say that there is a right or a human right to being loved? Instrumental justification do not justify any right. They simply reinforce the importance of certain things for us. Okay, non-instrumentalism. While instrumentalism starts with the identification of some more or less objective human values and then moves almost magically to the transformation into things we have rights to, non-instrumentalism relies on the intrinsic worth human beings supposedly have. The point of human rights is not to protect the interests of humans, but to protect the status that humans possess. It is in virtue of this status that humans' interests acquire normative force. Thomas Nagel endorses this intuition about the inviolability of persons originally introduced by Kant as the basic ground of human rights. Unfortunately, like Kant and other orthodox, he does not think it necessary to justify that inviolable status. Similarly, Borting thinks the fundamental human right is that of having one's dignity recognized, but it says nothing regarding the grounds of that very dignity, why we have dignity. This unwillingness to say something of substance about human dignity needs further scrutiny because it exposes, in my opinion, the major problem with how orthodoxy is currently practiced. For example, after asserting that humans have dignity, Nagel puts a halt on any further inquiry by arguing that, quote, any attempt to render more intelligible a fundamental moral idea will inevitably consist in looking at the same thing in another way. In other words, there is no point in asking for a justification of the dignity humans possess. For Nagel, it is sufficient to realize that we possess certain basic rights and that they are commonly conceived as protective of a status as opposed to protective of interest, and generally immune to interest-based trade-offs. So we don't say that my right not to be murdered vanishes if we discover that my assassination prevents the murdering of two people. Hence, Nagel's argument seems to be the following. On the one hand, rights, and a fortiori basic human rights, are grounded in our dignity. On the other hand, our dignity is grounded in the fact that we have those rights. So it's an intuition, it's basically nothing we have to argue for, that I cannot be given the argument that I'm going to kill you because this is going to prevent two murders. Therefore, we have certain basic rights that are not easy to amend to trade-offs. It follows that the only way in which we can make sense of the existence of these basic rights is through an appeal to human dignity. What is the problem with this argument? Well, it seems circular. In fact, another by and large orthodox thinker, John Casiulas, seems to be aware of that. His cure against circularity is to say that an appeal to human dignity remains essential. That is what makes him partly unorthodox, but must be supplemented by a reference to fundamental human interests. Since we all have certain fundamental interests, and since we are worthy creatures that deserve to have these fundamental interests taken seriously, it follows that we have certain basic rights, in particular, and not accidentally, those that protect precisely those fundamental interests. So, according to Casiulas, bringing interest into the picture avoids circularity, Nagel's circularity, because we can now explain that, for example, we have a human right not to be tortured because this is one of our fundamental interests. The obligatory force of human rights derives, at least partly, from the fact that they address basic needs. So Casiulas has this ambivalent position between orthodoxy and instrumentalism. The obligatory force of human rights derives, sorry, I just read that. Moreover, we can now explain in a way not available to Nagel's pure deontological orientation why human rights protect certain fundamental interests rather than everything one has reason to care about, and why there can be rational debate on whether something is to count as a human right or not. The debate will be about whether X is an interest fundamental enough to generate a corresponding duty for all individuals, and therefore a human right to have X protected. Now notice the irony. The circularity Casiulas charges Nagel with also affects his own account. Since he, like Nagel, does not dare to explain why humans have dignity, he simply asserts that these creatures deserve to have their fundamental interests taken seriously. He, seems to me, begs the whole question. We have human rights that protect our fundamental interests because we are worthy creatures. And we are worthy creatures because our fundamental interests deserve to be taken seriously. To my knowledge, this is as far as the general Orthodox school goes nowadays. Even when people acknowledge that the omnipresent reference to human dignity in all major human rights documents may be something more than a rhetorical move that is a piece of the foundation we cannot do without, and some foundational rule is reserved for that notion, orthodoxy appears to be reluctant to say something about why we are worthy creatures, and that remains taboo. Finally, practice-based view. An increasing number of leading scholars, including Rhodes, Russ, Weitz, Buchanan, Samantha Besson, no longer sure that Buchanan fits here, but Besson and perhaps Thomas Pogge think that the essence of human rights is to be found in the role that they have come to play in the practice of international politics. Specifically, human rights define the limits of state sovereignty and, as a consequence, identify the cases in which the international community has the right to intervene to protect individuals from domestic authorities. Most of these scholars are non-committal regarding the possibility of having a moral foundation of human rights, so a deeper, more higher, deeper, whatever, moral stratus on which these political rights rest. So they say, I don't know about that. However, they believe that nothing essential is left out if we justify human rights by looking at the role that they have come to play in international practice. Their nature, the nature of human rights consists in the role in defining the limits of sovereignty, and their foundation is either the de facto universal or quasi-universal acceptance of these limits by institutions and people around the world, or the acceptability of the same limits given some non-parochial standards. In Rhodes' succinct definition, human rights restrict the justifying reasons for war and its conduct, and they specify limits to a regime's internal autonomy. For Rhodes and others, the authority that imposes these limits is something between the practice, so as a matter of fact, these standards now exist and they are enforced on the international scene, and the viewpoint of a normative authority that in this case is global public reason. So what's wrong with the political view, in my opinion at least? Even if one wants to be charitable, it seems to me three main problems stand out as particularly serious. To begin with, there is room to argue that the political view violates what Joshua Bowen calls the fidelity condition. This condition demands that any philosophical account of human rights must be faithful to, or at least not too distant from, the way in which human rights are introduced in official documents and appealed to by activists around the world. Now, the main human rights documents, as I already mentioned, from the Universal Declaration on, all introduce human rights as expressive of the intrinsic dignity of the human being. In line with the central intuition of natural law and natural rights, the ancestors of human rights, I think Bache-Moyne, these documents construe the normativity of human rights as fully independent of states, institutions, and established patterns of international politics. Precisely because of this independence, I would say, they are thought of as capable of limiting the authority of states and of providing criteria with which we can critically assess existing political realities. It thus seems that practice-based justification turned the normativity game upside down, making the obligatory force of human rights depend on the existence of the status quo instead of having the authority of the latter, including the sovereignty of states, depend on pre-existing normativity of certain rights. So that's why I think that it violates the fidelity condition. However, just to be fair, the political view does not need to be rendered as so passively replicating whatever the practice of human rights dictates. Following Rhodes' methodology in political liberalism, scholars like Cohen, Weitz, Ferrara point to public reason in its global version now, obviously we are not talking about the domestic context, as the instrument through which human rights can and should be identified and justified. So no longer just an appeal to practice, but it is intellectual authority, we could say public reason is. Since global public reason is a reflective authority that does not simply mirror a modus vivendi, but promises to yield an agreement between comprehensive doctrines at the political level, even if none is available at the deeper moral one, these scholars think to be able to avoid the acritical acceptance of whatever the practice has established. At the same time, since the appeal is to shared normative principles, so global public reason is after some shared, not moral, not necessarily moral, but certain political principles, but they have to be shared, they manage to justify coercion, because human rights coerce, by presenting them as norms emerging from shared global political values, pretty much like domestic public reason establishes constitutional essentials by appealing to shared domestic political values. Okay, so why not appealing to global public reason? It's not passively replicating the status quo, it's an authority, it guarantees shared principles, it guarantees that when it hurts in the name of human rights, we are not imposing anything that other people might not have endorsed, might have endorsed, have good reasons to endorse, I don't know, something like that. So why I don't think global public reason is a good tool for identifying and justifying human rights? Well, various reasons. I mean, I'm going to say some, just few of them, there are more, but again, for the sake of brevity. First, let's keep in mind that the perspective of public reason presupposes public reason on domestic level, so its original form, presupposes a willingness, and I would say a habituation to establish a certain degree of detachment from our deepest comprehensive convictions in favor of a negotiation with other individuals who adhere to reasonable comprehensive doctrines radically different from ours. So public reason of the domestic context is really presupposes an ability of each individual in the polity to make a distinction, a crucial distinction between what he believes in as a matter of comprehensive doctrine and the political values he adheres to. That's, if people are supposed not to be able to make this distinction, public reason is of no use. Not accidentally, Rawls confines the idea of public reason to a conception of well-ordered constitutional democratic society, and clarifies that the form of and content of the reason, of this reason, are part of the idea of democracy itself. So Rawls seem to think that public reason works only within liberal democracy, because it presupposes a liberal attitude towards difference shared by all reasonable citizens, liberal and non-liberal. So non-liberal citizens living in a liberal democratic society are expected to share an ability to adopt, when discussing public and political issues, a viewpoint that is detached from their comprehensive doctrines. And this expectation is fairly well grounded, I would say, because they are socialized within a society whose institutions are mainly based on liberal values and on neutrality toward comprehensive doctrines. So even if you are a non-liberal who lives within liberal democratic institutions, you are socialized in a setting that habituates you to make this fundamental distinction between your religion, your metaphysical view on the one hand, and political views that, the political values that we supposedly share. Now, you see where I'm going, right? One cannot expect the same of non-liberal citizens socialized within non-liberal institutions. Why should they discuss about justice, national or global, or about human rights by adopting a detached viewpoint? Public reason can hardly be generalized to non-liberal peoples in such a way as to become global public reason. Obviously, non-liberal peoples may arrive to the exactly same normative conclusions concerning human rights dictated by global public reason, in all likelihood, however, they will do so not because they use this instrument, but because of some overlapping with parts of their comprehensive doctrines. So, even if you are a hardcore Christian, you want to believe in the equality of all human beings simply because you think that they are the offspring of God. We are all equal in the eye of God. It has nothing to do with the political value. It's a strong comprehensive value, and it gets you exactly where global public reason wants. But I want to highlight the difference that if we are talking about political standards, non-liberal peoples are better thought of, capable of reaching an agreement through an appeal to their comprehensive doctrine, as opposed to being able to silence them and appeal to political values only. So that's the first main problem I see with global public reason. Second, while public reason is a promising tool to become as tolerant as we can inside a liberal democratic society, namely to respect the fact of pluralism, one should never forget that the main reason why we can afford to be tolerant towards illiberal forms of life in liberal institutions is that citizens preserve the so-called right to exit any illiberal context in which either they simply find themselves or that they have previously chosen, but no longer endorse. So the usual example of the woman when there's a religious group that assigns to her less rights than the male members of the group. At one point, she's tired of being discriminated, said, I'm leaving. And that's perfectly possible within a liberal democratic setting because the state is not enforcing any religious view. Now, again, you see where I'm going. The right to exit is our privilege. For an adult woman living in a liberal society to freely have right to vote as long as she decides to do so in virtue of her, say, religious beliefs is one thing. To live in a country in which there is no way out from this condition of discrimination is quite another. Global public reason cannot capture this crucial difference, and that's the main point, because it has an intrinsic tendency to identify as legitimate representative of a people, so of a nation, only the voice of the cultural and religious majority. So that's Cockshortan's famous paper against the law of peoples. Thirdly, a global public reason constituted by representatives of peoples ran contrary to the reiterated point made by Amartya Sen regarding the dangers, intellectual and political, of grouping human beings according to one criterion of classification. The selection of representatives of different civilizations or even of smaller entities, peoples, that collectively constitute global public reason is ultimately the outcome of a previously morally far from neutral grouping of human beings according to one preferred criterion. If rights in general and human rights in particular are intrinsically and rightly biased in favor of individuals over groups, why should we abandon this perspective when such bias would be most beneficial, namely when the need of defending individuals from all possible forms of majority's oppression is particularly urgent. So even if it seems to me that even its most sophisticated form, through global public reason, the political view, like the preceding ones, fails to yield a convincing account of human rights, let alone a foundation thereof. And now, the solution. How and to what extent can one go beyond the present state of affairs? My working hypothesis is that the suggestion present in all major human rights documents that these rights derive from the inherent dignity of each human being must be taken seriously. In addition, I assume that if one wants to make a philosophical contribution to the culture and perhaps practice of human rights, one must overcome the prudent silence of the drafters, not only of philosophers, also the drafters said nothing about why we have dignity, of those documents, and say something as to why human beings have dignity. In choosing this path, I know that my position will appear as a form of hyper-orthodoxy, or perhaps of fundationalism, to use Stasiula's derogatory label. And to make things worse, I take my lead from Immanuel Kant in its search for the reasons of our dignity. And even if I quickly depart from him on a number of crucial points, this choice will still be perceived by many as somewhat bizarre. Three aspects of Kant's thought seem to constitute an insuperable obstacle. To begin with, when Kant talks of humans' innate right to freedom, in my opinion, the closest thing to a theory of human rights we have in Kant's whole corpus, it is not clear whether such a right can be safely considered equivalent to a human right as we now understand. Moreover, Kant's ethics is perceived as distant from the attempt, recommended by nearly all experts of human rights, to find some non-metaphysical basis to which representatives of different cultures and traditions can give their assent. And finally, Kant's account of human dignity seems to rest on his controversial doctrine of our belonging not only to the phenomenal but also to the nominal world, a very metaphysical tenet indeed. Notwithstanding these difficulties, I think Kant has much to say to philosophers of human rights, even if this lesson has been surprisingly ignored or misunderstood. To begin with, not only does Kant offer the material for a powerful alternative to instrumental and political accounts of human rights, which is no surprise because, of course, he's distant from both schools, he also, and more interestingly, cuts deeper than non-instrumental foundations as they are currently practiced are capable of doing. His well-known explanation is that we have this awe-inspiring capacity for moral agency, Corina was mentioning before. And one may be critical that this is the right answer, but one can hardly deny that an answer like this one is precisely what is missing in contemporary orthodox accounts. So, will a sympathetic reading of Kant's ethical thought be sufficient to provide a foundation? No, unfortunately. One will have to construe Kant's notion of moral agency in a manner broad enough to induce other traditions and cultures to buy in, even those very different from the Kantian and, more broadly, the Western tradition. If one succeeds in advancing a compelling argument to show why an appeal to moral agency, to autonomy, is not of limited parochial reach, we will have the basis for a foundation that for once does not avoid the main question that any serious account of human rights should address. If a Kant-inspired foundation is worth exploring, the following might be a reasonable way to proceed. I mean, I'm going to give you really the thesis. I don't have space here to argue much for it, but I will say something in terms of objection. The central thesis is that humans have dignity because they are capable of this unique form of freedom, namely autonomy, that allows them to perform actions motivated by what they take as morally obligatory. The argument is largely inspired by Kant, as I said, and yet it shares with Kant only the intuition of a link between a capacity for moral agency and dignity. Down the argumentative path, whose detail I cannot present here, I tackle a couple of turns that make my approach significantly different from anyone Kant would be ready to endorse. To begin with, I hold that autonomous agency need not be restricted to agency under the auspices of the categorical imperative. I argue rather that authentic, duty-based moral agency occurs even when people act under different moral imperatives, such as the Golden Rule or other well-known moral formulas, including the maximization principle dear to utilitarians. Also, and perhaps even more against Kant, I deny that autonomous agency is a peculiarity of human animals, defending the weaker thesis that humans are merely capable of this form of agency to a higher degree of development, so to the highest degree of development in the animal world, so a difference in degree not a difference in kind. Okay, so cannot go into the details of the argument, but that's clearly the structure of what I want to defend. Let's try to be clear on the main objections I am vulnerable to by taking this approach. This is a list, I'm afraid not exhaustive. So the objections can be divided into internal objections and external objections. The former arise from a skepticism about the solidity of the Kantian basis from which the whole argument emerges. That's why they are internal. First and foremost, some will argue that my foundation relies on a metaphysical assumption related to our alleged membership in the nominal world. Others will object to Kant's alleged proof of our freedom, proof made particularly suspect by its reversal, the reversal in the order of the argument that Kant makes in passing from the groundwork to the second critique. So he himself had a hard time in providing anything closer to a proof of our autonomy. A related objection stems from the latitude I conceded to the formula that on my account formula different than the categorical imperative guides authentically autonomous moral behavior. History is full of what could be called the deontological barbarian. So once I open the Pandora's box and I say, you know, not only the agency inspired or guided by the categorical imperative is okay or is expression of our autonomy, then I have to face the problem of what I call the deontological barbarians. That is, people who were acting certainly on principles, but who were clearly barbarians. So examples are easy to find. I mean, you know, the Nazi officials that remain faithful to Hitler, and they commit, you know, they sacrifice themselves when the Allies enter in Berlin, or whatever crazy deontological barbarian you may have in mind. Finally, a discussion is probably needed to reconcile Kant's view of human dignity with his doctrine of radical evil. If humans are bound to prioritize self-love over morality, are we sure they are the creatures a Kantian approach can vindicate as worthy of respect? Okay, that's a non-exhaustive list of internal objections that I think I get once I take the road I just described. The second set of objections are independent of weaknesses in Kant's ethical thought or in my interpretation thereof. To begin with, one must deal with Joseph Ra's idea, already mentioned in our criticism of instrumentalism, that traditional approaches like mine tend to conflate what one has reason to value with what one has a right to. Even if we are autonomous entities, does that imply ipso facto that we have a right to a certain kind of treatment? Closely related is the so-called threshold objection. If human rights are grounded on our autonomy, what exact level of liberties and resources humans need to have their autonomous status properly protected and respected? I think that this is a question that also Corina, in her own intellectual framework, was trying to address. An orthodox foundation such as ours might end up in the awkward position of generating either too many or too few human rights, which is obviously always the worst thing that can happen to a philosophical argument. You don't do well in either direction. On the one hand, autonomy in Kant's system and in my account as well is the basis not only of human rights, but of all rights we might be entitled to, moral or political. This is the too much charge. On the other hand, if human rights are meant to protect our autonomous status, then, as already pointed out by Dento in his reply to Gewehr, not Griffin, who is very similar to him, and reaffirmed more recently by Raz against Griffin, human rights could do little more than guarantee that people are not given chemical substances that impair their autonomy, their ability to steer their life, and in this sense, to be being autonomous. And that would be the too little charge. In addition, I don't know what I wanted to say here, but it doesn't matter. Moreover, a foundation that links human rights to dignity via the capacity for moral agency cannot afford to ignore a classical objection to Kant's ethics. Here we in the language of human rights. If our dignity depends on the possession of certain rational capacities, in our case, capacities for moral agency, does it follow that people with severe mental impairments do not have human rights or have them to a considerably lesser degree than fully rational people? Schroeder thinks that it does, and for this reason she concludes that even a secular, non-religious notion of dignity, like the one we are operating with, is a non-starter for explaining why all human beings have human rights. Finally, the most difficult objection is whether my foundation has a chance of resonating sufficiently well in non-Western civilizations, assuming that the notion of civilization makes sense. To what extent is focusing on individual autonomy as the ultimate basis of our dignity consonant with tradition that do not seem to place much emphasis on the value of individual responsibility and or refuse to conceive of human dignity without a reference to God as the ultimate ground of any value human beings have? Why should they accept that the value of dignity understood in the specific manner I am proposing is either explicitly recognized as central in those traditions? Why should one? Okay. Why should one accept that this value is recognized as central in those traditions, or at least implicitly considered as a precondition of any other value? Okay, so I'm going to conclude by, after having given you the list, non-exhaustive list of objections, I'm sure that others will come in the discussion. Let me show you how I intend to reply to some of them, in particular 3 of them. Let's start with the value-pride conflation that Ras thinks affects not only instrumentalism, but any traditional account of human rights, so also mine. Ras argues that the basic misconception that affects any traditional account is that it misconceives the relation between values and rights. The simple fact that certain conditions are necessary for our life or for a worthy life does not prove that we have a right to them. Even if we agree with Griffin that personhood is the most important feature shared by all human beings and that we all recognize this importance, we have still to prove that we have a right to the conditions of personhood, whatever they may be. By the same token, Ras argues, if being loved is the most important thing to me, then I would have a right to be loved, which is absurd. So, now, to what extent is, of course, the question is, this objection, which I think is very well taken to instrumentalism, affects my approach. Notice that what distinguishes my approach from Griffin's is that I do not start from the premise that we are interested in a capacity of ours, autonomy, and for that very fact we are logically bound to take the conditions of autonomy seriously, up to the point of protecting them through a set of rights. I rather hold that human beings are inherently worthy creatures, and for that reason they ought to be treated in a certain way. What they are interested in is completely irrelevant. Autonomy is for us not the most important thing, and we are not entitled to human rights because of the importance we attach to it. We are worthy creatures that deserve respect regardless of whether we recognize the value of that feature. Moreover, unlike Griffin, for my approach, autonomy is not objectively valuable in the same way in which love or being loved is. It is not a commodity a good of some sort. It is a status. It means occupying a place in the universe that rules out certain forms of treatment as incompatible with that status. In the same way in which only certain forms of addressing judges or high public officials are consonant with their role and function, so one cannot sincerely esteem the human status attached to our autonomy or secured by our autonomy and at the same time engage in the sorts of abuses, discriminations, and offenses we usually understand as human rights violations. And this leads us to the second objection. Okay, let's concede that I'm not as vulnerable as Griffin to Ra's objection of the value-right conflation, but even if that is the case, we still need to face the problem of how many resources do we have to give to people who we know have this special status, and that's the threshold objection. And here, things do not go as well as with the first objection. The question for my approach can be reformulated as follows. What actions or omissions are required to esteem human beings in the proper manner? What do we have to do to ensure that we are taking seriously enough humans' autonomy? Or more directly, what rights are to be considered human rights in order to make them adequate protection of humans' autonomous status, and not of everything that is valuable in life? Now, I don't think there is any easy answer to this question, and I admit that finding a threshold is a problem for me as much as it is for any other orthodox or instrumentalist approach. No, orthodox approach, not instrumentalist approach. There is, however, a key advantage that I can exploit. And this has to do, again, with the inherently deontological as opposed to interest-based nature of my approach. I don't need to ask what it is needed to ensure that human beings keep their status as autonomous, let alone realize it or the like briefing agency, what is needed to remain a purposive agent. On my approach, this status is never lost, no matter how degraded and base the conditions humans find or put themselves in. My question is rather, what postures do we, individuals and institutions, need to adopt to respect the status humans are entitled to by the fact that they are the sole fully autonomous beings on Earth? This question does not ask what factual conditions need to be realized for ensuring that human beings keep their autonomy or have a reasonable chance of success in doing so. This question asks how individuals and institutions have to treat people if they want to be respectful of their dignity. Now, okay, that's the advantage I think I have, but that doesn't yield any clear-cut answer to the threshold objection. Now, our intuitions can come to rescue. Our intuitive moral sense tells us that with a good degree of approximation that all the times we use humans merely as ends, we are acting in a way inconsistent with that status. The same moral sense also tells us that political decisions that make utterly impossible or extremely difficult the survival of those beings when alternative institutional settings are available are also incompatible with that rank. Analogously, any form of arbitrary discrimination is ruled out by anyone who takes that status seriously. Conversely, letting people suffer the consequences of bad choices that they have made is compatible with their autonomy. And also respecting people as autonomous is fully compatible with the fact that we don't love them. Thus, we can easily avoid the case Ras uses to ridicule the orthodox view in its general form. Now, this is still insufficient to set a clear threshold. In fact, even lying to people may be considered as incompatible with taking their autonomy seriously, and yet nobody would say that there is a human right to trustworthy private relations. It is no accident, however, that Kant himself construed lying as a violation of a moral duty, not of a juridical one. Those who lie to, argues Kant, remains free to believe us or not. Hence, their sphere of external freedom is not diminished by our lies. Now, human rights, even if grounded on a moral property, remain juridical or proto-juridical constraints. They are, and they should be, the reason there should be no human right to sincere private relations, because being told the story we can freely believe or not is fully consistent with our status of autonomous beings. A completely different case would be one in which the institution and social structures in which one lives did not provide the necessary means, mainly education, to be able to resist manipulation. Now, beyond the specific case of lying, I think that the most promising way we have to answer the threshold objection is simply to concede that the specific ways in which societies decide what it takes to respect people in a way consistent with their autonomous status legitimately vary, depending on socio-economic and cultural context. Each society is expected to spell out in its own way what respecting human beings requires, and there is nothing incompatible with my approach in acknowledging that the threshold will vary with time, even within the same society. Obviously, the latitude of the possible reinterpretation of this standard has limits, because taking people as the only autonomous beings on Earth is not compatible with everything. So, as I said, discrimination according to sex, race, religious belief is ruled out, no matter how discriminatory practices are embedded in a given society. And this immediately makes it evident that acknowledging some variance in the threshold does not mean betraying the universality of human rights, let alone giving to relativism. As I already said, there are things that institutions and individuals around the world do to humans that are utterly and irremediably incompatible with their status as autonomous beings. The culture and practice of human rights, that's where the practice of human rights, in my opinion, aptly comes into the picture. The practice has already determined these things with a certain degree of precision. The fact that no infallible or uncontested or perennial threshold has been set is a fact that not only my approach, but the whole culture of human rights has to face. So, the political view Raz admires, obviously, now I have to admit, the threshold objection is a problem for Orthodox, it's a problem for, may be a problem for instrumentalists, is clearly not a problem for the political view. Why? The threshold for the political view is simply what the practice of human rights has determined. So look at the list of human rights that are out there, that's the threshold. Whatever the international community considers enough to constitute a breach of national sovereignty, that is the threshold. For example, if we consider the responsibility to protect as the accepted set of rules for the international community anything that the document considers as a good ground for imposing political, economic, or military sanctions is the required threshold. Obviously, the problem with this procedure is evident and takes us back to the general problem with the political view we have already encountered. The philosophical task of setting a threshold for human rights becomes dangerously close to a fully political compromise reduced to the de facto consensus reached in the international community. And no critical space seems to be left, and future possible shifts of the threshold will be determined mainly by the striking of a new political compromise. The difference with our approach is that while the political view simply mirrors what international practice decides or appeals to the problematic notion of global public reason, we see the philosophy of human rights as best carried out through a methodology that holds reflective equilibrium. On the one hand, in the traditional manner, we start from the recognition of human autonomy to determine what given certain historical circumstances, what Griffin calls practicalities, treating autonomous people required. On the other hand, we check the tentative threshold determined by moral reasoning with the practice of human rights to correct and adjust our hypotheses. And we continue this correcting one source or the other, or better, one source through the other, until we reach reflective equilibrium. Now, I'm not going to give you the 2 points in which reflective equilibrium can help you to strike, to draw this line to reach the threshold. And maybe I'll have the chance to present them in discussions. So, let me go to the final objection I want to reply to. The famous objection to Kant's ethics that, if you focus on reason, I don't focus on reason understood as rational capacities, I don't focus on freedom understood as the mere capacity to set ends for oneself. I appeal to a rather specific notion, which is autonomy, that Kant distinguishes only at one point in his career, more or less at the time of the groundwork. Up to the first edition of the first critique, he thought that basically practical freedom, a freedom that makes us independent of the world of nature, but that still presupposes some sensus motive, is enough for the sake of morality. It's only with the groundwork that you have the grand entree of autonomy in the picture, and I'm appealing to this notion. If you appeal on any of these 3 notions, reason, rational capacities, freedom, as practical freedom or autonomy, what do you do with people that seem to be protected by human rights but have either not yet developed the full rational capacity and a fortiori the higher faculties that are distinguished, or have temporarily or permanently lost those capacities? So my foundation would run into these 5 difficulties. Human rights are commonly understood as tools in the hands of the weak to defend themselves from abuses of all sort. If we end up denying human rights to people who are particularly weak, like children, elderly people, sick people, something essentially wrong seems to be in my approach. Fortunately, neither Kant, that's the last point I make, neither Kant's moral thought nor my foundations are bound to such counterintuitive conclusion. First, let's distinguish the cases we are dealing with. In the case of children, one can hardly quarrel with the fact that they are given less rights than adults, and that this happens precisely for the fact that their rational capacities are not fully developed, so we don't let children vote. And nobody thinks that's a diminution or a violation of their status, whatever that is. At the same time, their potentiality for reaching full autonomous status is part of the reasons why they have all other rights, humans or not, we usually attribute to people. Actually, sometimes they have certain rights, like access to certain state benefits designed to help their development, adults do not have. Hence, we attribute more or less rights to children precisely by using their autonomy or potential development thereof as moral compass. Analogously, elderly people who lost in part or fully their ability to think are denied certain rights. Think of all the restrictions that come with the declaration of non compos mentis, and yet keep other rights because we still respect them for what they were once capable to do, think and act autonomously. Respecting a rational creature when its capacity for full autonomy behavior is in place seems to entail respecting her even when she happens to lose, in part or fully, that capacity. Mark cannot be said to be really respecting Charles now, when Charles is a fully autonomous agent, if it is understood that Mark can do whatever he wants with Charles the moment the latter loses his ability to think. If that is the case, then Mark was not respecting charts even when he was elder. The same point can be seen from another angle. Imagine how odd it would sound if I were to tell you, I respect you because you have this wonderful capacity for moral agency. Hence, I make sure that you enjoy all the rights that come with the status, whatever they may be. But also rest assured that the moment that capacity will vanish, I will stop considering you a subject of rights up to the point that you are degraded to the level of animals or the like. One can certainly restrict, like in the previous case, the number of rights one enjoys. So if you really lose this capacity, then the number of rights you enjoy can diminish. But of course, what matters here is the principle. We cannot ignore the person in question and her intact capacity for suffering, for having interests and needs, without affecting negatively, in retrospect, the way in which we were treating her. And mutatis mutandis, the same can be said for people who have lost temporarily or permanently their thinking ability because of accidents of different sorts. 5 minutes is more than enough. A different case is that of people who were born with severely diminished rational capacities that, as we know, will not improve in the future on people born with diminished or no rational capacity at all, that will not improve in the future as a matter of scientific certainty. In this case, I submit, we are permitted to treat these individuals in a way in which we treat other sentient animals, and that our respect should be made dependent and perhaps proportional to their capacity for suffering, as opposed to linked to the recognition of a status most of the times non-amenable to trade-offs and weighting of other people's interests. So I'm prepared to buy the bullet here and say that the merely human shape of your body, if you don't have reason, if you have basically no rational capacity, is not going to entitle you to the protection of human rights. So there is nothing, that would be speciesism on my account. Like, you know, the mere fact that you have the same, that your body has a human form, is not clear to me that entitles you to anything more than what animals are entitled to, because of course they are sentient creatures, so you try to avoid pain. You cannot treat them as you like, but you don't treat them with like persons. So, in fact, I think it's interesting to see that something that has nothing to do with human rights in a completely different intellectual debate goes on with Peter Singer's and Shelley Kagan replies to the account of speciesism that Peter Singer famously throws basically at everyone but himself. So Shelley Kagan makes a compelling case to show that one can both identify the source of worth in rational nature, in my language, autonomy. Now, of course, we don't have the same notion, but it doesn't matter for the sake of the argument, and be able to attribute to people born with no rational capacity the same protection we attribute to normal human beings. Kagan starts from the premise that the reason why we attribute to humans a higher status than individuals of other species is not generically what makes us human, but specifically the part of our genetic setting that constitutes us as persons, which Kagan loosely identifies as rational capacity and self-awareness. We don't think, to use his famous example, that an evil act against Superman or E.T. is less of a problem because these two individuals are not human. The offense is perceived by us as serious because Superman and E.T. are persons in the specified sense. So we are moved by a narrative in which Superman is, violated by the enemies, or they do something bad to him, even if, of course, Superman is not human, precisely because we attribute to him the same features that we attribute to usually humans, and it makes both most humans and Superman NFT persons. So, while these individuals are not, this takes us to the point about humans with no rational capacity that interests us. According to Kagan, while these individuals are not persons, they are nonetheless members of a person species, that is, of a species that most of the time display in its individuals the required features of person. It is in virtue of this membership that these individuals deserve a better treatment than primates or animals in general. Notice the focus is not on the species Homo sapiens as such. This is a mere accident that the species Homo sapiens normally carries with it personhood so defined. The focus is on personhood itself, no matter where it is embedded, in humans, in Superman, in heroes, fictional, it doesn't matter. The last point, reveals the main problem that I have with Kagan. I'm very sympathetic to his way of making this fundamental distinction between humanity in general and personhood. I think that we need to appeal to the latter. At the same time, when he wants to say that people born with no rational capacity cells remain in the sphere of the persons, I think that it basically contradicts himself. If being a member of the species brings to individuals a special value merely, as he says, in virtue of what the species normally displays, and that by definition these individuals do not, those born with no rational capacities, it is not clear why we should grant them the same protection we reserve to individuals endowed with the relevant features. It seems that one could do so only through the endorsement of that speciesism from which Kantian's model personism was supposed to be sharply distinguished. So Kagan has this great intuition that what we respect is really personhood, not defined as Griffin does. In fact, we can see that by thinking of these fictional cases of Superman, E.T., and so on and so forth. But then he also wants to say that since usually a certain species displays this feature of personhood, also the members that do not have that feature need to be respected because they are in the same family. Now, this is exactly speciesism. So if you argue that the ground of respect is personhood, you are committed to say that people who do not display this feature, individuals that do not display these features, cannot be respected in the same way in which individuals that have must be. So the conclusion I have is simply that the dignity approach I'm defending as an attempt to remedy the shortfalls of the contemporary philosophy of human rights, at least when it's applied to the foundational problem, has the gigantic comparative advantage, in my mind, of facing the real challenge any foundation cannot afford to face, while avoiding the question begging, which is pretty much what happens in current orthodoxy. That is, the dignity approach says something about the reasons why interests of human persons matter and why not all institutional settings are compatible with the place human beings occupy in this world. Not denying that this approach is deeply controversial and it lends itself to a number of serious objections that await satisfactory answers. The resources, though, to rebut these objections are not as limited as people seem to assume, as the examples I've given, I hope, show. So, thank you very much for